Today, cautionary tales of plastic surgery are displayed on the internet for everyone to see, from famous celebrities to people looking to emulate their idols. And though the effectiveness of cosmetic surgery over its long history has improved dramatically, some procedures have been known to leave their patients permanently disfigured. Minor plastic surgery has become ubiquitous and a prerequisite for many public-facing careers, and many attribute its main use to enhancing one's physical appearance. However, for many centuries before this, plastic surgery was used to help patients with disfiguring injuries return to a somewhat normal life. These surgeons became famous during their efforts in World War I and World War II, but we rarely hear from the patients themselves about these procedures. The victims of these disfiguring injuries became the guinea pigs for cosmetic surgeons around the world. And although scientific inquiry was furthered significantly due to their efforts, the soldiers were the ones bearing the physical memories of a war that simply cost too much. What you're about to see may shock many of you, but this was the reality for patients during this era. Despite doctors' best efforts, many of these soldiers' dreams of a normal life after the war left little to be desired. For Tank Officer Robert Cohen, his last steps on the battlefield during the Battle of Somme were just as nightmarish as his first, as he watched his companions die over the ensuing months of his engagement with foreign enemies. It was 0700, and the sound of gunfire began anew to mark another day on the field. He prepared himself for another unceasing day. Little did he know that this would be his last on the battlefield. As he stepped out to greet the blood-tinged sky, the last thing he remembered was a deafening explosion before a fade to black. He was now in his comrades' hands, and was carried back to base to be the next unwitting subject in a new kind of experiment, facial reconstructive surgery. But before I dive into Robert's story, first let's look into the history of plastic surgery and how it rose to its prolific position today. Plastic surgery draws its roots from ancient Indian surgeons as far back as 800 BC, where a man by the name of Sushruta is the first in our recorded history to have documented his understanding of skin grafts. His compendium is one of the earliest comprehensive looks into many surgical techniques and illustrates India's rich history in surgical procedures. Progress slowed for many years after this, constrained by a combination of limitations on the technology at the time and the people themselves. True visionaries take time. Further breakthroughs began to resurface much later at the hands of Roman physicians, a culture that prized physical beauty. They often took it upon themselves to operate on former gladiators in an attempt to return them to their former glory. These innovations were focused on refining the delicate soft tissue structures of the face, the ears, the nose, and the lips. The notable contributions of Galen of Greece and Annulus Cornelius Celsus laid the foundation for reconstructive surgery that was used as a guide even 1700 years after the creations of De Re Medicina. Further advancements allowed the introduction of crude anesthetic medications, some relying on simple ethanol, others turning to opium poppy capsules that contain morphine, and henbane seeds containing various amounts of scopolamine. It wasn't until the 20th century where true progress was born. With the advent of large-scale battlefields and devastating new weaponry, came with them a host of new injuries never before seen. A note on the conditions described during these hostile encounters with the enemy. Head and facial injuries became more common. This was partly due to the type of cover that a trench provided, which meant that the soldier's face was the most vulnerable part of their body. Bullets had also changed from their traditional rounded shape to a more pointed one, which embedded itself within the flesh, dragging clothing and dirt with it. Suddenly, surgeons were forced to create new techniques in facial reconstructions. Many saw it as an opportunity to advance plastic surgery to a new level and dedicated their practices to it. Anesthesia and infection prevention advanced alongside it. Although some of the facial surgeries performed were in fact necessary for a soldier to actually have normal function, such as jaw reconstruction to help chewing and remodeling of the nose to facilitate breathing, many were aesthetic in nature. For it wasn't until we as a race were faced with such an enormous scale of injuries that we began to truly understand the importance of our faces. Not only were our appearances linked to things like success and a flourishing love life, but our own sense of identity. It wasn't until this crucial realization that plastic surgery was able to take its place among other respected surgical practices. Now, during this time, no plastic surgeons were more renowned than Harold Gillies, who managed to apply his new surgical technique to over 5,000 patients. His results varied, much like the injuries he was presented with, and his journaling of the various case studies highlighted the experimental nature of his works. Some required years of treatment with no prospect of returning to the battlefield and returning home with permanent disabilities. Now let's return the conversation back to Robert. As he awaited his upcoming surgery, lapsing in and out of consciousness, he recalled the nurses discussing his condition. His prospects looked grim, but he did hear of a surgeon that was preparing to operate on him in the coming days, to try and build his face anew. Mirrors were not allowed within the hospital, and his face was bandaged so extensively that he wasn't sure what he truly looked like anymore. Thankfully for Robert, he managed to survive the operation, but his return to the naive world of his hometown in Australia did not come with the triumphant sounds of victory and courageous service. His hopes for acceptance met little to be desired, for he watched his comrades who carried their scars on the inside welcome with loving arms despite the raging torment within, while his reminder of the horrors of the battlefield lay etched on his very skin, forevermore changing him. One could say his identity died in those fields in southern France, eroding into the soil to this day, marking the end of one life and the start of another. With the weight of this knowledge, he fashioned a new identity, one that reflected the hollow world he had returned to. A wooden mask with 32 vertical stripes painted white, and through 2 narrow slits you could see into the soul of a man, shunned by society and desperate for humanity. The price of his sacrifice. He wore his mask day and night. It became him, and when it came time for him to leave the world he sacrificed so much for, he lay there as the coffin lowered, mask still firmly attached, a permanent reminder of our lack of acceptance of the faces of war. Unfortunately, Robert's injuries were exceedingly common among soldiers returning from war, and marked the juxtaposition between those who advocated for war and hailed its courage, but struggled to reconcile those that returned, permanently altered, both on the inside and the out. These procedures were marked as a revolution, but the efforts of doctors did not prepare them for the ugly face of society. Children hid from their fathers, sweethearts turned away from their lovers, couples once so deeply entwined that lay dreaming of what could have been, slowly drifting apart. Suffice to say, their ideals of returning to trumpets and marches left little to be desired. These early forays in plastic surgery paved the way for modern aesthetic surgeries. This is where surgeons first encountered the relationship between how well they could return a face to its appearance beforehand and the prospects of that patient living a somewhat normal life. And in some cases, our haunting lack of empathy for those that sacrifice so much in the name of freedom and victory. I made this video to show us all that the fresh-faced recruits we see in television portrayals of war often fall well short of reality, and the soldiers with the broken faces should not be forgotten, both for their courage and their sacrifice. We place an incredible importance on faces, and today even more so than the past, as evidenced in social media, which has become synonymous with the rise in the popularity of plastic surgery. On the one hand, plastic surgery will continue to help many people with functional issues, but buried at the very heart of it is the fact that many undertook these procedures not to help themselves, but to satisfy the superficial whims of the society we exist within. Thank you for sticking with me until the end and joining me on this journey to investigate the hearts and minds of doctors and scientists that came before me. If you would like to support the channel, you know what to do, and see you in the next episode.